when it comes to just all generations in general, one of the best things for increasing engagement, retention, kind of I see is twofold. When someone feels they have ownership of what they do, and when someone feels accountable to a team. These two things ripple for every generation, but I feel like for Gen Z specifically, where the digital infrastructure of the world, i.e., you have these platforms, LinkedIn, Glassdoor, Indeed, you can move around in roles so much more easily. So people talk about that loyalty clash, which I know we probably won't get into right now, but it's a whole can of worms to open there.
Welcome to the Elephants in the Boardroom podcast. As always, I'm your host, Graeme Codrington, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Dean, on the other side of the world. Dean, where are you today?
I'm in just south of London.
I'm also south of London, just a little bit more south of London than you, based in my studio in Johannesburg, South Africa. And well, as we look at the world from our various vantage points, obviously right now there's a lot of chaos, maybe more than normally, especially in the Middle East. And maybe let's just start there. We often start these podcasts by doing an update on what we're seeing in the world, and you can't switch on a TV or listen to a podcast these days without obviously considering what's happening in and around the various parts of the Middle East. And we're not a news podcast. We're not here to do news or geopolitical analysis. But as we look at our perspective of the disruptive forces that can shape the world and how you should prepare for them, a question crossed my mind. That as we sit here at the beginning of April 2026, looking at what might happen next, I suppose the question is, what is predictable and not predictable? Is it even possible to look for, I wouldn't want to use the word certainty, but to try and look at who are the actors involved and is it clear what they want? And Dean, as I look around that region, I think, interestingly, I think some of the people or the countries involved are a little bit more predictable. I think it would
Mm.
probably be fairly easy to say what they're going to do next. Um, if we start with Iran, I think Iran has proved to us over the last month they're not going to be backing down. They realize that this is an existential moment for them, and I think that they have been very, very clear that they are in if we can use religious text references, they are in an eye for an eye moment now. So you blow up a school, we'll blow up a school. You blow up a water plant, we'll blow up a water plant. And they are clearly attacking Israel on an ongoing basis and attacking American bases in the region on an ongoing basis, and American assets. And I think that's going to just remain. If you attack Iran, they will respond and they will continue to bomb Israel. So I think that's clear. From Israel's perspective, I think they've been clear for a while, and by a while I mean years and years, that they are wanting to expand the land that they have access to and protect their borders. And that means pushing into Lebanon. It means expanding their settlements in what is known as Palestine, West Bank, and so on, and continue to do what they're doing in Gaza and keep that blocked off. So I don't see any reason for Israel to make a change. I mean, I have personal preferences about what they do, but I'm saying about looking at what their choices are and what they plan to do. If you look at the other Middle Eastern countries, obviously each of them is aligned in certain ways. Hezbollah in Lebanon is not going to back down. The Houthis in Yemen are not going to back down. But if you look at the GCC countries, from Saudi Arabia through to the UAE countries, they are desperate for peace. For them, they will do whatever it takes. They're desperately hoping they come out of this with all of their relationships intact. They want to keep relationships with China, keep relationships with Europe, keep relationships with America. But I think that they are finding it increasingly difficult to justify keeping Americans' military on their land. And that, of course, is what Iran is hoping that they will end up with. So I think they won't do anything dramatic one way or the other until Iran, Israel, and America have resolved their issues. But I think in the background, they must be frantic and really loud diplomatic work going on to try and get the various parties to settle. NATO have taken their hands off and just said, guys, you're on your own. I mean, the UK is offering one of their military bases for the B-52 bombers. Again, I'm not so sure comfortable with that. But anyway, those are choices. But basically just said, guys, go for it. You know, this is not our party. And so it really leaves us with the USA. And I think that, Dean, my view is that whatever the USA does, that is the deciding factor at the moment. So I don't, again, we're not trying to get into the deep weeds of analysis or make any predictions here. But I think if America turned around in the next few hours, days, or weeks and said, okay, we've had enough of this, let's try and find a way to get peace, I think we'd have peace quite quickly. And if America said we want to put boots on the ground and crush the regime in Iran and install Pahlavi as the new Shah, well, I think that they might be messy, it might be long, but I think that if that's what they decided that they wanted to do, they would certainly go ahead and do it. So right now, interestingly for me, if you're desperately needing to know what happens next because it's a huge factor in your life and in your business, I think for me, the key factor right now is what happens out of the USA. And sadly, I think that what we can see there is that it is very, very unpredictable. I say sadly for us, sadly for us as business people trying to live our lives, run our businesses. Sadly, I don't think that certainty and predictability are available. But the only sliver of good news in that is that it does appear that Donald Trump and his administration at least are speak out loud what they plan to do, and don't have any filters about letting us know what they're going to do and what they thought of what happened. So for me, I'm keeping my eye on those press conferences, checking it against what Israel and Iran say to see if it matches up with what's happening in the region, and hoping personally that peace will come faster rather than later. But that's my view of where we are, Dean. I don't know how you see it.
Graeme, I think you're right. Let's hope peace comes quickly. But that said, the whole idea of the grey elephant radar, grey elephant lens, is not about predicting the future. It's more about saying, I mean, we are where we are at the moment, and the reality is when a grey elephant appears, it's too late to prepare. So what's happening in the Gulf? It's too late. We can't do anything about that. We've got to, as you say, watch the indicators and see how that plays out. Again, we need to step back and look, what are the trends saying to us? What are the grey elephants? How they're talking, how they're playing out, and what does that mean for the future? Because, yeah, as Graeme, as you know, we're big believers the best way to predict the future is to create it. So given what's happening around us, given the trends, what can we do in our position as a leader, as a company, as a country, to create a better future? So I kind of look at what's happening at the moment, and I think for me, the interesting sort of data points, and one is the changing face of warfare. I saw a fantastic cartoon, and we'll provide this cartoon in the notes. It's in The Economist, and it shows a dominant industrial power, missiles and aircraft carriers and everything, and then a whole lot of swarm of drones covering their face, and I think that's kind of pertinent to the view that we have at the moment, is that the power dynamics are shifting. Where we talk about this in multipolarity, it's no longer about the superpower being all dominant, and we're seeing that with Iran and how it understands the economic levers that it can pull, and this is a war on many fronts, and then the economic war front is one that's really, I think people are really starting to feel. We need to step back and think, what does this mean for the future? And I'm interested in what's NATO, America's, let's call it the West's kind of competitors are looking at this. What are what are China? What's China making from this? India, for that matter, Russia, yeah, the rest of the BRIC nations. I think there's a real growing sense that perhaps the superpower of the past isn't as strong as it was. And we've seen the shift in the dynamics of geopolitical dynamics, and it's starting to play out real time. So, as leaders who are thinking about their business, their future, supply chains, and so on, to really start thinking, how do you play in this multipolar world? Because what's playing out here is multipolarity in the real time. And for me, that's the fascinating part here. What's going to happen to multipolarity? And I want to come back to one other data point that we often talk about, Graham, and that's what we're living through is a once in a century transformation. Every 150 years, the world goes through a sharp transformation. And what we see at the moment are those data points or those indicators that are supporting the notion of a once in a century transformation. I think we'll look back in
Mm.
20 years and we will see how all of this played out. But we've got to navigate this over the next 20 years. And I think that's where the grey elephants can really help us to, powerfully think about the strategies, our business response, what matters, what doesn't matter. And ultimately, as you were saying, let's strive towards peace and creating a better world.
Dean, I think maybe we can pick this topic up in the next episode next month. We haven't yet had a chance to analyze the two sessions conference that China holds every year in March. And they're
Mm,
just about to release their updated 5-year plan for the rest of the 2020s. But we are predicting significant changes from the 14th 5-year plan that's just finished to the 15th that's just being released, is going to be that China is going to open their borders. I think both imports and exports will now be on the agenda for China. And I think this is China has probably been waiting 15, 20 years for America to make a significant, let's call it a misstep in global trade and global economics. I know for our friends in the Middle East that would feel like a horrible way to frame it. But what I mean by that is America messing up its economic control of relationships with Africa and South America and Europe and Asia, and China then being ready to take what we call in our elephants in the boardroom model the kairos moment, that opportunity that comes sort of once in a decade, sometimes even only once in a lifetime. So maybe we come back to this once we've had a chance to look at China's new plan. But I'm convinced that I know what it's going to look like, and that China's going to really be opening up, which is, in my opinion, really good news for those who could have a relationship with China in both import and export ways, because that is just an incredible market to be opening up. It does, of course, mean that our sponsors of this podcast, to be very grateful to Achilles. I don't think anybody there is sleeping at the moment, because if you're talking about global logistics and supply chains and being clever about what to do when things are tough in that part of the world, which is so important, moving goods around the planet. Achilles do a fantastic job of that. And if you need to improve, upgrade, and protect your supply chains, have a look at Achilles. The contact details and references in the show notes as well. But Dean, maybe leaving sort of current affairs behind us, one of the questions we always asked on the podcast is you've got your futurist radar switched on and looking for big disruptive forces that maybe are not quite yet in the room, but are coming soon to a boardroom near you. What are you seeing at the moment? And maybe it can just be a little bit more upbeat than a war.
I've got a really good one for you, Graham, and it's really on the other end of the spectrum, from war, peace, well onto the other side. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about bugs, insects, flying insects in particular. I came across a
Okay.
BBC article which talks about the decline of flying insects. So we're not talking about cyber bugs or anything like that. It's the insect type bugs, particularly flying insects. This to me is an interesting trend. It's a weak signal that we're picking up. but I think it's one that we need to be paying real attention to, and it's also one that we need to be doing something about. I'm going to liken it, not exactly, it's not the same, but it's kind of similar to the other bug that hit us a few years ago, the COVID bug. Graham, you know that we'd been talking about pandemics as a disruptive force for a good 15 years before COVID hit us. It was, your quintessential high impact, highly visible, largely ignored force of change. And I think what we're seeing here is a similar force. So what the data is telling us is that, so there's a survey that's been done in the UK by Bugs Matter, and the data is suggesting that insect splat rates are down 59% across the UK between 2021 and 2025. Okay, so you might think, well, what's a splat survey or your splat rate? So it's quite simple. You drive along in your car on a journey, climb out, and you have a look at your number plate, the front number plate, and you see how many bugs have been splattered against the number plate. You count that up, and you contribute to the survey. Yes, interesting, Graham. We bought a new car 2 months ago. Okay, I just went and had a look how many bugs on that number plate after driving around for 2 months. How many bugs do you think are on the number plate?
Well, I'm going to be bold enough to say none.
That's what I thought. I found two. And
Okay,
that
but
was kind
that's
of
still a
shocking to
low
me.
number. I remember going on our annual summer holidays, Dean, and you lived on the other side of South Africa back in the day when you lived in South Africa in the 1980s. We would have to stop. It was a 6-hour drive to get to the coast from where we lived. We would have to stop, not for petrol, but to clean the windscreen so you could actually see out of it. And that, so for me, that splat picture makes a lot of sense.
I was hoping you'd bring that up, Graham, because that was my experience as a young kid in South Africa. Was you'd get to 2, 3 hours into the journey, Dad would pull over, we'd get the squeegee and the mop out, and we'd clean the window because there were so many bugs. You couldn't see anymore. They were splattered across the windscreen. You don't get that anymore, and to me, that's an alarming trend. And so it's not just a UK story. As you're picking up there in South Africa, we're seeing a decline in bugs, and around the world, 75% of global food crop types depend on animal pollination. More broadly, a major global analysis found that terrestrial insects, the abundance has declined by roughly 10% per decade on average. Why does this matter? On one, no one really loves bugs, do they? I mean, they're they're the most lovable creatures. So, but this really matters because insects sit much closer to the foundations of the economy than most people realize. They contribute an estimated 600 billion to the annual crop output. So this is not just a niche environmental issue. It's about food security, it's about ecosystem resilience, land productivity, supply chains, and long-term economic stability. I think, like COVID, we don't want to sit around, and know that this is something that could have a high impact in our world, but we largely ignore it. We don't want to wait until we're near ecosystem collapse before we decide we need action. So for business leaders, I think there are a few practical sort of steps here. First, we need to cut pesticides across operations and supply chains. We need to support regenerative agriculture. We need to turn unused land into wildflower meadows and pollination corridors. We need to manage offices, campuses, industrial estates in a more positive nature positive natural ways that really encourage biodiversity, I guess, with the same seriousness as other strategic risks. I think the opportunity is not just to reduce the harm, it's to build more resilient supply chains, healthier landscapes, stronger, stakeholder trust, and better long-term value. Yeah, that's what I'm kind of seeing on my radar at the moment. I know it's a little quirky one. It's a little bit off-piste, but and it's a weak signal at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you. No, and I don't think it's quirky, and I don't think it's off piste. Obviously, it's got to do with food security and food chains, and natural food. And I'm desperately trying to resist the urge of jumping down the rabbit hole of going off on a massive rant about companies like Monsanto and Bill Gates Foundation, whose solution to this is to come up with genetically modified crops that don't need, natural things. Each year you produce a new set of crops. And I'm not against technology, and I'm not against GMO when it's needed. But it kind of feels like the wrong solution to the problem of this particular problem. I think my preference is still for natural, right? And that means in some ways protecting insects and bees in particular.
Bees are now on the endangered list in the UK. Did you know that?
I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me. This is frightening. And again, this is the point of the grey elephant radar, is not to just talk about horrifying things that should scare us. I'm going to talk about one in a moment that I think is very positive. But it's to look at the big things that everybody will look back in 5-10 years' time and say, oh, we should have seen that coming. But rather see it coming before it hits us in the face. And no, thanks, Dean. The insect splat rates. There we go. Add that to your business radar dashboard. It's worth it. What I am seeing, Dean, to bring that positive move is incredible advances in medical technologies. And here let me combine two things. Artificial intelligence, anyone who's listened to the last few months of conversation will know, Dean's on the more optimistic, positive view of what AI can do. I bring quite a bit of skepticism about it. But the one application that I see, which seems to just be astounding, is the application of data analytic ability, pattern recognition, and looking and finding things in data sets that human beings have missed, or the data sets are just too big for our existing analytic models to work on. AI just has this ability to just look at a data set that size and find patterns. And of course, one of the data sets that exists, and we all have to deal with it at some stage or another, is those people who pass away. And when we have friends, when we have family who pass away, we go through that dark valley of grief and loss. But we also know that there is more medical data related to your life that is gathered in the last 6 months of your life as our current medical science desperately tries to work out what's wrong and how do we solve the problem, and how do we extend your life. But the data that is gathered as life ends is astounding. In the NHS put out a financial report a few years ago saying that half of the money that is spent on a person's health in the UK is spent in the last 6 months of their life, in terms of the actual cost. And we understand that, and I think it's right to do everything we can to extend life. But that data now exists. And artificial intelligence models are beginning to be applied to that data, and especially to diseases that we are still rightfully scared of, cancer and lupus and others. And Dean and I both have personal experiences with those over the last little while. And analysis that's coming out and the possibilities for cures that are emerging it just seem to be wonderful. For me, this is the best news I can almost imagine sharing with people, that it looks as if we are going to be able to discover things about these diseases that we haven't known before, that potential cures and alternative therapies are going to emerge. There's going to be years of experimentation and trying things, years of trials, but it really does look as if the medical profession and the researchers surrounding them are gearing up for an absolutely jaw-dropping decade ahead of us. And I think 10 years, 15 years from now, we'll look back and just see these remarkable advances, which will then, of course, improve health and well-being and life expectancy as well. So, Dean, everything from the protein mapping project to potential cancer vaccines for pancreatic and breast cancer, to early identification of breast cancer, so early that human beings are just saying it would be impossible for us to see those markers. But AI is beginning to look at markers that human beings didn't know even existed, especially in breast cancer, and that seems to be spot on. And so that AI label, I stand here, Dean, asking you to accept a small apology for being overly skeptical about AI, because at least the data modeling part of it can be applied in these wonderful ways in the medical world.
Well, that's a moment to mark. I will remember that one. Uh, no, I think you're right. And, the next 10, 15 years, we are going to see phenomenal advances as a result of what we're able to do with AI and large data sets. And it's not just health, energy is the other one. And I'd actually like to talk about this in the next podcast. Fusion energy is benefiting enormously from AI. Fusion energy is one of those technologies which, if we can crack the code for fusion, the whole energy landscape would change completely. All of the conflict that we see over oil, I think it would largely dissipate. And there are potentials for, as you say, for cancer, energy over the next 10, 15 years, which will radically change the world. And that's the exciting thing. And that's the world I think that leaders need to be preparing for and thinking how they benefit from that and how we move towards those things, because that would be really, really exciting.
Absolutely. So, Dean, our quiz for today, if you are ready. And our quiz leads us into the topic of our interview. And so I'm not giving anything away if I say that our interview today is with a generational expert who looks at different generations and, the young and old debating. We'll introduce him in a moment. But first, Dean, I thought if we're going to introduce the topic of back when I was young, take you back to when you were roughly the same age as your son Leo is right now, and looking ahead at your life and all of your plans. So I went back to 1980 and I had a look at what was the average starting salary, what would a house cost, what would a car cost. Now, this is difficult to find this data, and it's obviously almost impossible to average it out across the whole planet. So I did go to the United States, who has kept the best data for 50 years on this stuff, and it's the easiest one to do. So this is a very American-centric quiz today, Dean, but I think it applies across many of the countries where we have listeners. My question is going to be about what did things cost in the 1980s versus what do they cost today? And the only tip I'm going to give you is that the inflation multiplier from 1980 to 2026 is roughly 4 times. So $1 in 1980 is basically $4 today, right? If you've got that in your mind. 297.6% if anybody wants to be precise. So, Dean, in 1980, if you were just starting out as a young professional, I know you weren't, you and I were both in school then, but if we were the same age as Leo is today and we're thinking about what would we earn as our starting salary as a young professional graduate, in 1980 the average was $10,400, which in today's money, inflation adjusted, would be $41,000. $41,245 to be precise. What do you think today's average starting salary is for a young graduate professional in the United States, if they could even find a job?
I'm going on anecdotal evidence here and what people have said. And
Yeah.
I've come across indicators of saying that actually what people are earning today is actually quite a lot higher than what you would imagine. Okay, let's just cut it. I'm going to say it's close to 50,000. I'm probably wrong, but let's go 50,000.
No, look, your thinking is spot on, Dean, because right now you've got the tech sector, which has just gone out of control, right? If you are a 24-year-old, I mean, you don't even have to be a graduate. You could probably be an 18-year-old. And if you've got a little bit of AI coding credibility and you can get a job at Meta or Apple or, one of the Google or NVIDIA or so on, I mean, it's insane. You could get $200,000. But On the other end of the scale, if you are a teacher or a nurse, it's actually gone down
Mm.
since the 1980s. And
It's
on
frightening.
average, this is actually an insane number. This is why I thought I'd bring it up. If the 1980s salary adjusted for inflation is 41,245 average in 1980, the average in 2026 is 41,392.
So
So
that's spot on.
congratulations, you've had about a $12 a month improvement over 45 years. Well
Well,
done, America. And now let me explain. It isn't actually plateaued. They've gone backwards. I won't make this a quiz, Dean. Well, I'll make it just a yes, no for you. But I'm now going to quickly give you the cost of a house, the cost of a car, and the cost of a university education. Do you think that's gone
up.
up or down? Yeah. Do you think it's gone
Yeah,
up a
and the
lot
cost of
or a
education,
little?
cost of cars, houses, I'd say it's gone
Yeah.
up a lot.
Exactly.
Mm.
So a house, the average house has gone up from $250,000 to $416,000 for your average entry level house. I mean, can you even imagine? Cars have gone up. This is in today's money, $30,000 would be in 1980. You could buy a sort of an entry level car. Today it's 50,000. Again, there's secondhand cars available. I'm not saying everybody's first car costs $50,000 today, but that's the average sticker price of a new car. And then the big one, of course, as you already spotted, is for a private college degree in 1980, you could get it for $50,000. And that was all in. Now it's 180,000, and that's tuition only.
And Graham, that's why we're seeing the grey elephant that we call the angry people, really started to get very restless, if not stampeding, periodically stampeding. So, Graham, I'm really interested to hear what your guest speaker has to share with us. It's a generational expert, and I assume you'll be talking about these dynamics and what the young people of today are facing, as well as older people, I guess.
Absolutely. So when we get back from the break, we will be hearing my interview with Zavier. Zavier Coyne is a leading expert in digital natives in the workplace. And Dean, this was interesting to me. As you know, I did generational theory. It was actually the topic of my master's thesis back in the 1990s, and wrote a best-selling book called Mind the Gap. When I was as young as Zavier is now, 30 years ago. And it was fascinating speaking to him and just the angle that he brought, and I think he's spot on. He's a recognized thought leader on generational intelligence, and as I said to him in the interview, I'm kicking myself that I didn't come up with GQ as a label, but he's doing it brilliantly as he helps businesses to understand the potential of this younger generation as they come into the workforce. Zavier is also a TEDx speaker. He is an advisor to a number of top companies. He's a University of London guest lecturer and co-founder of an organization called Gen Z Coach or Gen Z Coach. You can find them at genzcoach.com. And after the break, I hope you enjoy the interview as much as I did.
Elephants in the Boardroom is proudly brought to you by our partners at Achilles. As a leader in sustainable global risk management for businesses and their supply chains, Achilles helps the world's largest companies build and maintain ethical, sustainable, and transparent business practices. While we explore the elephants in the boardroom, Achilles is at the forefront guiding businesses through the risks and the opportunities these grey elephants present. If you're interested in how change impacts your supply chain or ESG strategy, it's worth connecting with Achilles. Visit achilles.com to learn more.
Zav, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. It's wonderful to have you, and I am super excited. Anybody who knows about my history will know that I have a history of looking into generational theory, understanding the differences between young and old people. And if you ask me, this is one of the big elephants in the boardroom. We all know the differences are there between young and old. There's these divides and even conflicts. And
Mm-hmm.
this is what you do. I know your business, Gen Z or Gen Z coach, is
Mm-hmm.
focused on this, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there's more specificity behind just, hey, it's old versus young, it's generational theory. I'm just going to open the floor to you because I'm
Yeah.
really interested in what you see as
Mm-hmm.
this Gen Z, Gen Z issue.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. And I love that we're starting at that position because it is such a bigger conversation. It's not the classic cyclical generational dynamic of young thinks old are a bit out of touch and old thinks that young are lazy. There's something that's fundamentally different, which is that Gen Z are the first digitally native generation in the history of humankind. And that's quite a sentence when you sit with it. And I'll just unpack briefly what that actually means. And so it's a person whose cognitive and social development was impacted by immersive digital technologies in their formative years. And that's something that's only going to continue happening. And we'll break that down, I'm sure, in a moment, some of the impacts and what that means. But it's a really fascinating time for both society and indeed what that means for the world of work.
So you are seeing specifically, as you say, generational differences have been around since
Hmm.
ancient history and complaints of
Yes.
today's young people and, etc. But there's something else that's happened here, and you are
Hmm.
specifically labeling it as a digital
Hmm.
issue.
Yes.
Can you give us maybe just one or two examples of how that might
Mm.
play out so that we can see it
Yeah.
practically?
So communication obviously is a massive area that links to kind of all areas of our life, indeed also performance in an organization. If I think about and just label an understanding of social media, smartphones, we bring that kind of into the mix briefly. I'll give you an example. So right now we're having synchronous disembodied communication. Synchronous in that me and you are speaking in real time, disembodied in that we're not in the same room, right? And as a generation, Gen Z are the first generation to grow up with asynchronous disembodied communication in their formative years, i.e., growing up with you receive a message, you can sit with it, you kind of process it, you send a message back. It's not in person as much as it used to be, and it's not in real time as it used to be. And this is a really crucial thing to look at, especially when we think about those formative adolescent years. What's the impact of loads of those micro communications over time on how we think as a generation, how we process our feelings, how we express ourselves, how we navigate conflict? All of these things start to be rewired as we look at a generation that is the first generation literally in history to have that kind of communication as they grew up. So that is just one area and a bit of language that people often find quite interesting of asynchronous and disembodied v synchronous and embodied, because it does make such a difference, and it does link as well to that kind of hybrid way of working that we're starting to move into too. So that's just one small example. There's so many more I could go into.
Well, this conversation is going to be one of my most difficult because I think between you and me, we could probably do 4 hours without even
Yeah,
blinking on some of
exactly.
these. But already what you've said is it takes my mind in a whole lot of directions. So
Mm-hmm.
in the sort of more smaller direction, if you like,
Sure.
I can immediately see that there would be a whole lot of etiquette issues here. Like, for example, do I switch on or off my blue ticks in WhatsApp? To be like quite specific, I get irritated with younger generations who I can see you're not letting me know if you've seen my message because you want to choose when you engage and respond. You don't want to let me know, I saw your message, but I chose not to respond. And for me, I'm not sure whether I label that as rude or unprofessional. All of those labels would be wrong. But that's sort of the small side. Then on the big side, you even went there while I was thinking about it. This must have huge implications for how comfortable somebody is with hybrid working or virtual meetings and so on. So I can see this at the very micro level and at macro organizational design levels. And I'm guessing that's what you spend your days helping people to think through.
This is it, yeah, and it's very interesting when we start to unpack that Gen Z kind of stereotype that comes up in the media, and I'm very much a believer that we can't bucket people into,
Of course.
labels, and of course that goes saying on this podcast for sure. But it's interesting when you look at generations of we're not kind of defined by them, but framed by the context of them. And I think when we look at Gen Z, it's the first digitally native, but very much not the last. And technologies are only getting more and more immersive, and so actually addressing the behavioral implications of this is really important. And another example that comes up, we often hear Gen Z, they're entitled. And we hear that come up quite a lot in the companies that we work with. And it's actually understanding, well, if we look at in that scenario, I like to phrase it that we're kind of looking at the fish. We're not looking at the water, so to speak. So we're looking at the fish and we're saying, Gen Z are lazy, they're entitled, they're all these things. And then if we look at the water that they're in, the water, i.e., from my perspective and sharing on this conversation, is the digital environment that's actually, polluting the ability to develop effective behaviors in certain ways. So if I use that entitled, I go back to it. When we speak to senior leaders, help them understand how does this kind of translate into workplace impact. A generation that's grown up being able to order food when they want, being able to find out information at their fingertips. We've moved from an information scarce into an information abundant economy and society, and we're able to find out anything we want, get instant feedback from social media, kind of at our fingertips. We are conditioned for a very short feedback loop. If I want something, I can get it. So then we
Yes.
go into the workplace, things are slowed down a little. And so that feedback loop isn't kind of nurtured in the same way that society and digital conditioning is creating. So that's just one way that we can start to build that empathy and that generational intelligence piece further into kind of the business and the ways of understanding digitally native generations.
So, what I'm hearing from you is the presenting frustration. Let's use
Hmm.
the language of the podcast, the elephant in the room. It might
Hmm.
appear that it is a divide between young and old, it's a divide
Yes.
between different styles of working. Your argument, I'm hearing, is that it's more a divide between the technologies that are available and what those technologies have
Hmm.
then enabled in terms of behaviors and that. Let me phrase that as a question. Have I understood
Yeah.
that?
Yes, it's a good point, and I mean it also specifically from how it's affected us in a non-workplace context, and then how it's translating into a workplace context, not just technological literacy. It invites me to kind of share the language of the difference between being digitally native, being digitally adopted. And we have this period in time right now, which is a very unique period. Eventually, in the medium to long run, everyone's going to now be digitally native. But we're at this kind of inflection point where we have people who are digitally adopted, and you have some generations that are incredibly digitally fluent, i.e., really amazing at technology, but they didn't grow up as digital natives. So there's kind of different language here. You've got the digitally native piece of the generations growing up with immersive digital technologies in their formative years. Then you've got the digitally adopted, which anyone who's using technology from another generation is. But then you've got those who are digitally adopted who've become digitally fluent, i.e., other generations who've really understood and got to grips with technology. And what I'd say then, it's really important, just because you're digitally native doesn't mean you're digitally fluent. And that's important
Ah,
too,
okay.
because some people presume that everyone who's Gen Z has just got, the digital kind of tech literacy at their
Mhm.
fingertips going to be amazing. And then, we see in some of the organizations we work with some real gaps in technical understanding that's not just generationally based. The main impact I see is the behavioral side from being digitally native, from growing up in with your formative years with social media, smartphones, AI, the internet being commercialized. So that's kind of why also Gen Z, the first person of Gen Z born, depending how you take these bands, roughly 1996, and the internet was commercialized in 96. So that's why there's that rough mark
That's a
point.
nice dividing line there. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah,
So this then goes back to the danger of generalization. Let's talk about that for a little bit,
100%.
because what you're saying is you cannot assume that every younger person is brilliant with
Hmm.
technology, and if you give them the option to work from home, they won't be lazy. They'll be on their computers, brilliantly. You also can't assume, and for those who maybe are listening to us on audio and not looking at
Hmm.
our beautiful faces on video, might not recognize we are probably talking about a digital native in Zav and a digital
Yes.
adoptee in Graham. But
Yeah,
you can't assume, if you just look at me and I'm an older guy, you can't assume
exactly.
that I don't know what I'm doing with
Hmm.
technology. And that's where generalizations can get us into trouble. And maybe more traditional generational theory needs to make a step up into this way that you see it.
100%, and I encourage everyone based on that to turn their cameras on if they can to see Graham's wonderful face. But it's a really good point, and what I'd like to lend to that is being digitally native is not a homogenous experience. Basically, it's not a standardized kind of okay, you're digitally native, so you experience life like this, or you have these qualities. There are some amazing strengths to being digitally native. There's some amazing challenges to being digitally native. And I'm sure we can touch a bit on in a moment, but some people have experienced that as really increasing, for example, hyperanxiety. Some people have experienced being digitally native as a way to be incredibly entrepreneurial. So you have a very different way of taking that seed, that initial stimulus, and how it manifests differently in people based on a variety and intersection of different things.
Well, let me pick up on that point then. If we do have people who are listening to us or watching us who are in the older generation, give us a little bit of hope that we're not completely irrelevant and washed up already. How does this lens that you are
Mhm.
using to see the world help us? Speak to us first.
In terms of the leaders in other generations.
Yes, and not necessarily only leaders, but just people who might think, well, what can I do now? I can't go back and become a digital native. I'm older, but I don't want to. I don't want to just abandon ship, right? So, is what have you seen is sort of best practice for maybe an older generation who wants to engage in good faith and get the best out of a multi generational team?
Brilliant question, and I'd love to enjoy going that conversation that direction because it presents some amazing opportunities for both all generations, but also for obviously businesses too. The one thing I'll say, just to touch on your point there, is actually the importance of generational intelligence. That language, which I would loosely define for the purposes of this moment as the ability to effectively understand, empathize, and communicate across age groups. And so, for a generation that isn't digitally native, to have that curiosity to go and explore with conversations with younger generations to understand what being digitally native means can provide, and I've seen stimulate so many interesting ideas for them on how they want to navigate their lives, how they want to bring up children, how they want to lead, how they want to work. And I feel like there's an opportunity here where, and the reason I use that term generational intelligence is because it's not just about trying to bend to one generation. It's about all generations opening up this awareness of, wow, like we can be so shaped by what happens in our formative years, whether that's from our early career experience or just indeed the environment we grew up in. And we can learn so much from each other. And so I like to often suggest to people just to organize a light-hearted generational, like I call it a GQ conversation, just to go and have a conversation with someone to really just understand. Actually, I'd love to know, Graham, what really shaped you in your formative years? What was going on in that period of time? What did that help you learn? How did that help you grow? And what could maybe I learn from just listening to you in that experience? It really opens up a level of empathy and understanding that I almost would be careful not to say I would know exactly what another generation could get from it because it would be subjective to every person. But what I would suggest is actually the stimulus to go and create those conversations with other generations who maybe are digitally native to see what you might learn from them, to see what it might stimulate in your thinking, I think is just a really beautiful step that can be taken in this dialogue and conversation.
I love adding this as another layer on the diversity conversation that we could have. So
Hmm.
you've got your emotional intelligence, and
Hmm.
I happen to be, depending on what frameworks you look at, I'm an introvert, I'm a thinker, and all, and you can then go and have conversations with others, not trying to bend them to become like me, but trying to understand why do they do it differently, why do they experience the world differently. We can do the same with cultures, and I love traveling the
Yes,
world,
exactly.
and part of that is the curiosity of other cultures. What food do you eat? What music
Mm.
do you listen to? How do you engage in conflict? I love the fact that we can bring that same level of curiosity, and instead of starting with irritation or you should do it the same way as me because let me look at it from my lens, because you're younger in the business and I've been here 20 years and you should do it the way I did it when I was your age. We could bring that same level of emotional intelligence, cultural intelligence to generational intelligence. I love that as a framing. And that goes both ways, right? There's always fascination in hearing those
Mhm.
questions about how did you experience it at a certain life stage, or how do you engage with whatever the framework, whether it's communication or relationships or dealing with conflict.
Yeah, I off the back of that, because I love how you've mentioned those other areas, and I know your background with that, the generational dynamics too. I'd love to hear from your perspective how maybe your thinking and approach to this topic has also evolved. Yeah, what kind of thoughts have you noticed have evolved through your experience and years when it comes to understanding this topic?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Zab. I'm kicking myself that 20 years ago I didn't put a trademark and copyright on generational intelligence.
Yeah.
Because that just seems like such an obvious
Hmm.
framework in which to do this. I think you're spot on that one of the key dividers between particularly the label that it's been given as Gen Z or Gen Z, that middle 1990s label, that history is going to record that as a seminal moment. Whether there's another one now with AI or not, I'm not convinced about that yet, because I think it's just an extension of technology enablement of how we pitch up in the world. And I am actually quite excited about being part of what is called Gen X in the system. We weren't the baby boomers. We were the generation who were sort of in the workplace in the 1990s. So we were the young upstart kids coming in, and then computers and the internet and digital arrived. We weren't digital natives, but we were excited that the world of work was being shaked up. And so we kind of at almost a transition generation. And we are now the CEOs, the directors, the senior leaders. And I want to shake up my generational counterparts to say, you can turn into your parents and become the grumpy old people and vote for the conservative politicians and try and live out the remainder of your life just protecting everything you gain. And I'm being very cynical about the old baby boomers, but so be it. But I think we can do better. And I think
Mm,
we can be a very powerful sort of pivot generation in history, giving space, giving psychological safety, giving
mm.
a voice to a younger generation who brings this digital native lens and supporting that. So yeah, for me, when I hear a younger person like you pick up these threads that have been part of my career for so long, I get terribly excited about what we could do together and what happens next.
That's really wonderful to hear, and I really like what you said about creating space as well, for those
Yeah.
conversations to arrive and that psychological safety piece. I think that's so fundamental for this conversation to unfold effectively. And it was interesting, I was in Davos during the World Economic Forum last month, and it was really interesting to see how they're starting to try to slowly but steadily bring younger voices into the conversations and actually not create too many echo chambers, whether that's culturally, whether that is generationally, and there's still a lot of work still to go, but it was good to see this conversation is now happening at that kind of level. That's because it also does link to the fact that it is a hot topic. Mark Zuckerberg's in court right now, and there's a lot going on when it comes to actually what is going on with the impacts of social media. There'll be a similar around with AI, and these technologies that move so fast. Actually, what are the slower impacts behaviorally over time for the generations who are using them in their formative years? It's really important because Gen X are often the parents of Gen Z. So
Yes.
it's everybody's challenge and opportunity to navigate together. So yeah, I love that answer.
So I'm going to ask you one question, but then ask you to answer it in two different ways. Um, uh,
Cool.
the question is, I asked you a few minutes ago, what would you say to the older generation? I'm going to ask you
Hmm.
now to just direct your thoughts to how should, and let's think about maybe specifically the world of work here. That's the average person who listens to the podcast. But how should young people sort of present themselves? I know you could give an hour-long answer, but at the short sort of bullet points, how should a young person present themselves in the world of work? So in an environment where they know they have a voice, they know they can be seen, they're not trying to fight for space, but is from your view and your understanding of this digital generation, what advice would you give to young people about how to make the best of the world that they're in at the moment?
Great question. On a very high level, if it was just to be one thing, because of course we have multiple workshops and a whole world of
No, exactly.
things that
There
we do
there are
here.
lots of answers
Um,
available to this question.
There's lots.
Yes.
My main answer would be about the importance of having a growth mindset when it comes to this. And there's a brilliant psychologist, Caroline Dweck, who has that book and framing that term. But really, the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And coming into the world of work as a young person, where we've had the impacts of technology shape us in different behavioral ways that have maybe been more challenging in our formative years than most have experienced. It's actually looking at how do we take ownership of our growth? How do we show up with curiosity? How do we show up with not seeing failure as something that is kind of final, but something that's an iterative process that we grow through? And actually, it's stepping into that feeling of being empowered is what I really invite young people into. Of actually, this is a beautiful opportunity to fail quickly, to learn, and to fundamentally look at how you own your growth. And that really comes down to the mindsets that we have. So that piece on and that book, The Mindset by Caroline Dweck, is always a great starting point for young people to kind of go towards, to understand, oh, I see myself reflected in some of those maybe more fixed mindset thought patterns. And actually, can I step more into that growth mindset? As a fixed mindset example would be, I feel threatened by others' success. A growth mindset would be, I feel inspired by other people's success. And so that's just a small example of how we can start to shift these internal narratives, influencing how we think and therefore how we communicate, fundamentally then how we perform and show up for our colleagues. So that would be my high level initial
Yeah, yeah,
answer
yeah, yeah.
to
No, no.
to
Look,
that.
a huge question. Well answered. And I suppose now I'm maybe giving the game away a little bit. I am going to be super surprised if any Gen Z people have made it this far into the podcast. If you have, send me a message, send me a DM. You and I will chat. I will send you a gift of your choice because I'm going to be super impressed. But I think the people who will be with us are our normal sort of CEO, senior leader, the cohort at the moment. Thank you for sticking with the episode. And so I want to essentially ask the same question, but I want you to frame the answer to a leader to say, how do we enable Gen Z to bring that growth mindset? And to give you just a moment more to think about it, I love your framing of a growth mindset because part of me as the older guy will want to pull a thread. It's not your thread, but it would be my thread out of that. To say to a younger person, you know what, you could complain about all the things that are not perfect about this workplace, and you could push us, and some of your complaints are valid, and we will probably want to do something about some of the things you point out. But you could also step away from that mindset and step into a growth mindset to say, I am here and I have a job here. And if I put my foot forward and come up with great suggestions, this workplace will reward that thinking. So I'd like to sort of start your answer with a challenge to the senior leaders. Make it a great place for people to give ideas, try things out, and grow. What would you add to that for senior leaders to hear?
It's interesting, like what you just shared. I was consulting with one of our legal partners earlier, literally today, and talking on this topic. And when it comes to just all generations in general, one of the best things for increasing engagement, retention, kind of I see is twofold. When someone feels they have ownership of what they do, and when someone feels accountable to a team. These two things ripple for every generation, but I feel like for Gen Z specifically, where the digital infrastructure of the world, i.e., you have these platforms, LinkedIn, Glassdoor, Indeed, you can move around in roles so much more easily. So people talk about that loyalty clash, which I know we probably won't get into right now, but it's a whole can of worms to open there in terms of what's actually going on. But bringing it back to briefly what that means for leaders to how to navigate that is to lend the ability for young people to have ownership of their work and to feel like they really, are contributing to thinking. So it links to what you said there. So that's the build on that point. And then is also feeling accountable to a team. When we feel like we belong to a whole that's greater than us, we feel like we're going to take less sick days, we're going to show up more, we're going to get work done. I mean, I know, you and I with what we do, I know that I work sometimes different hours and put in certain levels of work because I'm like, I have 100% ownership of what I've got to do. And I'm incredibly accountable to multiple different stakeholders in what I'm delivering. And so I show up and I really invest. And so how can leaders leverage those two things would be my question. How can you encourage deeper ownership of the work that they're doing and deeper accountability to a team, to a cohesion and a unit? And if I was going to also give just a final little nugget that comes up, which I love to suggest to leaders too, is the importance of going to get some reverse feedback. And I absolutely love this because everything we've said, and there's so much in terms of the work I do and exploring this area, but one of the things I've seen prove some of the greatest results is when a leader is willing to almost have that growth mindset that I just mentioned and be humble enough to go to the people that they're leading and say, listen, I would love to just carve out an hour to hear some feedback on how you think my leadership style is, on how you think I'm managing the team, what's resonating with you, what's not, and really open that space. And a tip for that is to create a psychologically safe space, is to come maybe with some ammo, some things maybe you could improve on, share that at the beginning, and then people see, okay, they're humble, they're open, they're willing to hear it. And the insights that you can get from that are deeply personalized to you and your leadership style is really amazing, what you might hear from some young people that you lead.
I'll add a top tip from an older guy on here. If you are using any form of generative AI platform, whether it's Copilot or
Mhm.
Claude or ChatGPT, and you sort of used it for a few weeks or months, start by asking that platform, based on what
Mm.
you know about me and the questions I've asked and the interactions we've had, what do you suspect my weaknesses might be as a leader? And even declare that to the younger generation, to say, you know what, I asked ChatGPT what it thought of me. It gave me this. Would you agree? So, you can, maybe it's a bit cheesy, but you could at least show off some, what did you call it, digital adoptee credentials, um, by bringing that into start. Uh, Zav, a final question. You've probably answered this, and your previous question we could have ended it there. I think it was beautiful, but we have one final wrapper that we use in our elephants in the boardroom mindset, and that is to say, of course, any change, any disruption brings threats, and it causes change, and that change can be distressing and destructive. But actually, it also brings opportunity. And what would you say the biggest opportunity is for people really getting the lens of understanding this is a disruption? In human history, we've got a before digital and after digital. And we now have the after digital people are now at an age and stage where they are in the workplace moving towards leadership. Many of them are entrepreneurs in their own businesses. They are beginning to influence society and political levels, in religions, in communities. So, I mean, as history happens, it is continuing to happen as it does. But what is the opportunity, not just for a company or a team, but maybe even for society and history, if that's not too big a question to throw at you? What's the opportunity with this generational shift in history?
The bigger the question, the better, Graham. I'm all here for it. So my initial, there's so many things that come up. It's from faster, experimentation culture in businesses. We can move faster in experimenting, being more agile. Everything from more purpose-driven innovation, and I could go on, but I want to answer the bigger question, which my gut tells me, and what I'm seeing happen is that we have this opportunity to rehumanize work. I would say that is the overarching opportunity, that we're now at that inflection point of digital natives coming into the workforce. We're looking at older ways of working being challenged, and we have this real, I think, amazing opportunity to, as a multi-generational society and workforce, create a more human form of work that taps into the parts of us that make us distinctly creative, that make us distinctly emotional and aware, and these parts of us that are beautifully human, as AI starts to roll in to take maybe some of the more automatable parts of work. So that is my initial gut feeling when it comes to this generational and technological change that we're seeing come through, is that it leads to this opportunity to really rehumanize work, which I am really enjoying seeing unfold in so many different companies. I could give you 101 different examples on that, but I'm aware of time. So if I was to leave it with one opportunity, it's for people to feel optimistic about that, to feel like we're at this real point that kind of is leading us to see, okay, there's this dangerous rabbit hole over there, but there's also this amazing abundance of light and ways that we can work over here too. And how can we start to move more to that, to actually rehumanize work, I think is incredibly exciting.
I think that is a remarkable way to frame it. If I'd asked anybody to finish the sentence, what is the one big opportunity from the digital world? I'm not sure too many would have said it is to rehumanize the world, but I think you're spot on, and for me that does leave me in a very optimistic and good thinking space. I
I'm glad.
really hope that people understand now why I've been desperate to interview you and to put your voice onto our platforms, because I hope that they come knocking on the door. What is the
Mhm.
best way for people to kind of connect with you, see what else you do, get into some of the other research your team has got? What's the best way to contact you?
The best way to get in touch is simply Zavier Coyne at LinkedIn. So simply just finding me on LinkedIn through my name, and then you've got the whole host of resources there, and website genzcoach.com is also useful. But I would say go to the LinkedIn and you'll see the most up-to-date things, and feel free to always reach out for conversations. My details are there, and my inbox is always open.
Perfect. And all of those details will be in the show notes as always. Zav, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Graeme.
I hope you can see why I was excited as I chatted to Zavier. I've got to know him over the last few months. And in fact, we've introduced him to a number of our clients because this issue of the generational divide is, in fact, one of the grey elephants, as you heard me saying. So if you would like to connect with Zavier, go to genzcoach.com. Details are in the show notes. Or if you would like to connect with him in the context that we work at the Tomorrow Today strategy group, in the context of understanding disruption and how to prepare for these disruptive forces coming, well then connect to us and we'll come and chat to you as a package together, because we think that looking at the world through this generational lens, maybe Zavier's digital native lens, but then also Dean and myself and our team's lens of the Gen X and the boomer lens as well. I think that together that creates a view of a changing world that is hugely important, no matter which industry you find yourself in. So as always, make sure that you contact us if that in any way we can be helpful in your journey of disruption and how to prepare for the future. Otherwise, thank you, as always, for joining us in the podcast, for sticking with us right to the end. Thanks to our sponsor, Achilles, and for all the work that they do. And we will see you again next month as we continue to think about and look at how the world is changing. Next time on Elephants in the Boardroom.
I think schools, as big as the ship seems to never sink, I think schools have to be careful that they stay relevant, that they're not blockbusters. Yeah, I think leaders, school leaders and parents have to be braver. And, if it goes back to institutions, our generation, my generation, the school system is broken, it doesn't work, it's a different time. And then the moment you say, okay, well, we're not going to be grading exams, or no, well, they need grades for university. No, they how else do we know that they're learning? So we can't just put this on school leaders and education. It's up to parents and corporate leaders.